Good morning and welcome to our wonderful panel discussion focused on clinical trials, equity in clinical trials. My name is Dr. Donney John, and I have the distinguished honor to moderate the panel today with some distinguished guests. Before we get started, I'd like to give you a little intro to this very important topic. This session is focused on emerging solutions and recommendations for patients and caregivers on the topic of equity in clinical research within the U.S. Current racial and ethnic minorities will constitute more than 50% of the U.S. population. Hispanics will make up 29% of the U.S. population. The fact is, though, less than 10% of racial and ethnic minorities participate in clinical trial and research across multiple disease conditions, including diabetes, HIV, and cancer. So the question is, why is that, and what are we doing to change these perceptions? We've assembled a group of experts ranging from FDA and industry to provide us some great insight. And I'm going to allow our distinguished panelists to introduce themselves and answer this very important question to lead us off. What is the value proposition for racial and ethnic minorities to get involved in clinical trial? So Dr. Clark.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Luther Clark. I'm at Merck Pharmaceuticals. I'm the Deputy Chief Patient Officer there. I also lead our patient insights team and our work group on clinical diversity in U.S. trials. This is actually an audience that knows this very well, so it's a little difficult to add anything new. But I would say there are a number of really important aspects of the value proposition, and I'll just highlight three of those. The first, of course, is that it's really important that any new medicines or therapies are effective and safe in those individuals who will be using them. And to the extent that we know that there are really a number of instances where there are differences in both efficacy and safety, it's key to keep that in mind. So that would be the first. We the patients, providers, all would like to know that these therapies are effective and safe. The second, if you have done your clinical research in a diverse population, particularly a population which is reflective of those who will be using the treatments, it engenders a tremendous amount of confidence in the therapy. And we all know that compliance and adherence is a major issue, and if there is confidence in the therapy that it works in for any individual, patients like me, however one defines that, then these patients are more likely to take the medication. So they're more likely to fill a prescription when it's written, they're more likely to be compliant, and as a result, are more likely to get the benefits of therapy. And then the final aspect, which I like to highlight, is really quite similar, and that if the research results have information on the important subgroups, then you're providing information that both the patient and their providers need to make decisions about their therapy with a greater level of comfort. So that this is information that is needed, that is desired by patients and providers, and if it's there, then it really makes it much better and more user-friendly in terms of the decisions that have to be made about an individual patient's therapies. So I'll start with those comments and I'll pass it on.
So I'm Lola Fashoyin-Aje, and I'm a medical officer at the Food and Drug Administration. I primarily review investigational new drug applications and marketing applications for that support evaluation of cancer therapies. I also have an interest in cancer disparities and lead sort of our office's efforts in trying to determine ways to improve enrollment of racial and ethnic minorities and really other demographic subgroups in clinical trials. So I guess to frame my response, I'd like to present a few slides, or did you want me to do that later?
Let's wait for the introduction.
Okay. I echo what Dr. Clark mentioned in terms of the value of ensuring that the evaluation of new therapies are consider any potential differences that may exist in demographic subgroups, including race and ethnicity. And I think that the value in that, especially in an area in cancer, is that we're sort of pushing the envelope in terms of the types of drugs that are being developed, many of them based upon molecular abnormalities, and the extent to which we can identify and clarify the incidence of these molecular abnormalities in diverse populations. I think that kind of research and that kind of inclusion informs even the development of new drugs if you're able to identify other targets that may be relevant in other demographic subgroups. And so I think I'll start with that.
Good morning, everyone. Oh, thank you very much. My name is Ravyn Miller, and I'm actually a U.S. marketing manager or director at Medtronic. And so I wear a different hat in that my background is actually not clinical, but it's on the sales and marketing side. So I'll answer your question by actually sharing a story. So we actually got involved in the healthcare disparity space after we had one of our field reps who worked in the city of Detroit actually make a really interesting observation. So he sold ICDs to our EP physicians and noticed that probably 90% of the people who were in the waiting room to receive a consult were white men. And so he said, I'm in the city of Detroit, Motor City capital of the world. And 90% of the people who are sitting in the waiting room to get a consult for an ICD are white males. And so after doing some research in conjunction with our marketing teams, we found that the cardiac burden for African Americans is actually really high, but the persons who are receiving these life-saving therapies are not necessarily reflective of that. You go on and then you look at some of the clinical research that's also affiliated with this, and you'll find that 30% of the persons who are enrolled in clinical studies for PCIs or for stent delivery 30% were women, 70% were men, and then you look at the clinical application of that once it's commercially available, and that still persists. You then look at that same PCI study for African Americans, for Asian Americans, et cetera. 80% of the persons that were receiving PCI treatments were white Americans, and then 20% were persons of color, but we know the disease burden is actually much higher than that. So I'm here to say that what we do in the clinical trial settings will then also then play out commercially once those products are available. So I have a very strong interest in that. We want to make sure that what we're starting out the conversation with, then it can actually impact us in the ways that we know are possible to get life-saving therapies to our patients, all patients who want care.
Hi, my name is Nicole, Richie. I work at Genentech for the past about 10 years. I've been in clinical development, so conducting clinical studies, and I'm a cancer biologist by training. I also lead our efforts, co-lead our efforts with a partner from marketing on diversity in our clinical trial space, as well as our clinical trial precision or personalized healthcare strategy. And so being at the end, it's hard because you've obviously covered some of the really foundational reasons this is so critical. So what I'll add is one component around science. So this is a particularly important time. You know, we sit at the intersection of science and technology where we have a deeper understanding of disease biology than we have ever had before. We have access to analytical technologies that make the availability of genetic information greater than we've ever had before. We are able to genetically assess people on an individual level. And this is, to Lola alluding to really understanding these mutations and mechanisms of action. It's important for all patients. And we have never been so well positioned to realize the vision of personalized or precision medicine. But we can only do that if we include all patients, and we have an inclusive strategy that that really ensures that clinical outcomes can actually be optimized for everyone. And we really run a risk. There's a lot of literature in academic setting as well as in a clinical setting highlighting the fact that personalized medicine, if we're not careful, could be designed for subpopulations of people of European descent. And that is not what the world looks like, as we well know. And so we have to be very careful and deliberate in ensuring we are inclusive, not only in our clinical trial setting, but broadly as we think about what personalized medicine will look like for pharma and the applications of that beyond.
Thank you. So at this time, I'd like to invite Dr. Lola Fashoyin-Aje to present some insight into the current state of racial ethnic minority, including cancer clinical research within the FDA.
Thanks. The big green one. So I wanted to, the thoughts expressed here are mine and not reflective of FDA policy. Oh, this is not going forward. Yeah, that's what I'm doing, but it's only, okay, good. So I thought I'd provide a little bit of background in the cancer space because I'm a medical oncologist and I review oncology products. And just sort of briefly touch upon as a basis for subsequent discussion on the panel, what we're talking about in terms of enrollment, because we have a general sense, and I think we're all here and know that there's a problem, and so trying to sort of quantify that problem, I think, was important as a starting point. And so clinical trial sponsors vary. I think we are familiar with the fact that NCI, the National Cancer Institute, sponsors trials, either conducting them, themselves or sort of deploying the resources for those studies to be conducted in academic settings and community settings. Other types of sponsors are investigators in huge academic centers and then pharmaceutical companies. So I just wanted to sort of provide that general orientation. There are various combinations thereof, but these are sort of the main categories. In terms of why the clinical trials are designed, they're designed to get new information. Sometimes that is to get information on products that have not been previously approved, and so the clinical trial is important in that you're getting the first set of data that tell you about the safety of this product and the effectiveness of the product in humans, in a human population. Other types of trials that I think we think about as well are, prevention trials or trials that are testing interventions to mitigate incidence of disease or mitigate severity of disease, but also that are testing approved therapies and comparing them against each other to determine what is the best use and for which relevant populations. So this slide is sort of a result of a recently published report that was evaluating the barriers to patient enrollment in clinical trials in cancer. And there's sort of the often cited statistics is that 3 to 5% of cancer patients enroll in clinical trials at some point during the course of their disease. And so the group that published this report was really trying to determine whether or not there's any variation in that incidence depending on where the trial is conducted or who's the sponsor of the trial. And so they, through a literature search and review of many, many studies, determined that the participation rate is a little bit higher in huge academic centers, not surprisingly, about 15%, but that participation rate falls to 6% in community settings, which is actually where the majority of patients with cancer receive their care. And so in considering those two statistics, their estimate was that about 8% of patients who have cancer are enrolled in some kind of clinical trial. Now, these may not necessarily be therapeutic trials. They may not be trials that are looking at new drugs or that are testing drugs. They could be prevention trials and so forth. So 8% is sort of the number to keep in mind. A little bit better than what we thought, but not so much. So in terms of demographic representation in clinical trials, so there's published literature that indicates that the enrollment of racial and ethnic minorities is lower when you consider the representation of these demographic subgroups among cases of the disease. And so I wanted to sort of provide data for government-sponsored trials because the use of public funding through NCI requires that racial and ethnic minorities be enrolled in a manner that's proportional to their representation in sort of the general population. And so you'll see here that whites are represented according to their representation in terms of incidence of disease, but that blacks are not so much. So this varies according to NCI trials and the SWOG trials, which are cooperative group trials. Cooperative groups are comprised of researchers and academicians and community persons who sort of form a group to oversee a trial. So I led sort of a query of our data at FDA, looking at the approval databases for drugs that were submitted for marketing applications starting from 2011 to 2017. And sort of looked at all new drugs in the treatment of solid tumor malignancies. And this is sort of the overall result that I found, as you can see. So on your left is the proportion of what is the patients enrolled out in clinical sites outside the United States, and on your right is in the US. And as you can see, the racial and ethnic minorities, if you can't see from back there, the sort of salmon colored is black or African American. White is the dark blue. And Asian is the light green, Hispanic is the dark green. And if you can see, there's sort of more diversity in the patients enrolled in the United States sites compared to outside of the United States. And you can see that there's more Asians enrolled outside the United States compared to in the US. But overall, racial and ethnic minorities comprise, a very small, less than 10% of patients who are enrolled in these trials. So this slide is really meant to just highlight the fact that to your right, the US population comprises about a third of all patients who are enrolled in trials that support marketing applications in the United States. And so this is vastly different than what it used to be when NCI used to be the primary sponsor that was sort of developing drugs. Now we have pharmaceutical companies are mostly the ones who are developing new drugs. And they're conducting trials globally that sort of inform this kind of number. So I wanted to dig deeply a little bit into the Asian subgroups. And depending on what your, I guess, ethnicity within the Asian subgroup you're either overrepresented or underrepresented. And so if you look on your left, this is sort of the result of the breakdown of where Asians who were enrolled in these clinical trials, what countries they were enrolled in. So mostly Korea, South Korea, Taiwan, mainland China, and Japan. When you compare, and then the US constitute 5% of patients enrolled from US sites came from 5% of Asians enrolled in these trials came from the United States. Now, if you compare that to the representation of Asians in the U.S. by census estimates from, their sort of country of ancestry, there's a discrepancy there. As you can see, there are certain subgroups like Filipino, Vietnamese who are really not enrolled in clinical trials. So it points to the importance of sort of looking at the data in a very granular fashion as you're trying to describe who's actually in these trials and who's adequately represented or not so adequately represented. And so this was for Hispanics as well. As you heard in the introductory remark, they're going to be constituting a significant proportion of our population in the next couple of years, and already do. And so we looked at the Hispanics enrolled, and the enrollment rate was about 2 to 3%, which is really dismal. And when we looked further at this and looked at the countries where Hispanics were enrolled, or people who reported themselves to be Hispanics were enrolled, mostly came from Spain or Brazil, which is not necessarily reflective of our Hispanic population in the United States, which tend, at least those who experience disparities in health outcomes, tend to have emigrated from, Mexico, Central America. And so, again, the numbers are low and the representation is not reflective of where we have problems. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. So the CDC conducted a campaign called the Racial and Ethnic Approaches to Community Health, called REACH. And what this program highlighted was that racial and ethnic minorities face more barriers in seeking care, including preventive care and chronic disease management, than do non-Hispanic whites. These disparities can lead to poor health outcomes and higher health costs. There are ongoing efforts to address some of these barriers. However, in clinical research, there may be different barriers that may need to be addressed. So my question to all of you is, what do you view as barriers to engaging racial and ethnic minorities based on your experience in clinical trials? Dr. Clark?
Sure. Thank you very much. Of course, I'm at Merck Pharmaceuticals now, which is a large global pharmaceutical company. Prior to that, I was in academia in Brooklyn, New York. And I think in terms of the barriers, one of the things that we did early on was a study ourselves to reaffirm and look at barriers, one that we did with the Association of Black Cardiologists. And we were able to, one, affirm barriers that are well known. And at the top of the list for all stakeholders was the barrier of mistrust, trust, and trustworthiness. A second barrier was awareness of the clinical trial process and comfort with it. And it was quite interesting that this was not only true among participants and communities, but even among, say, referring providers, who are often a key barrier themselves. But if the referring provider is not comfortable with the process, is not comfortable with a particular clinical trial, then they're concerned about referring their patients to the clinical trial, then often they will not do that. And then a variety of logistical issues related to travel, where the trial is done, and how it is conducted. And because we're a company that likes to work with data, we took our own information and developed what we refer to as a multi-stakeholder approach. And I don't know if you want to get into some of the things that we've done at this point.
So if you hold that thought, we're going to talk about stakeholders in a few seconds. So if we can just get everybody else's perspective in terms of barriers you've experienced in clinical research.
I think barriers to participation or to engaging patients in clinical trials is extensively documented. I do want to share that, particularly in the oncology space, the timelines are very truncated, which is good for patients because we want to get drugs we want to give patients access to more options for treatment. But I really see as a barrier in trying to enroll a more representative population in clinical trials, as I mentioned, sort of the globalization of clinical trials. And so this is good because we can get our trials accrued very quickly, and we can get to marketing applications rather quickly and approve new drugs. But we're also seeing a significant segment of the population not having access, even during that time when the clinical trial is being conducted. And patients who participate in clinical trials are afforded better care, and that's just, you get very good care when you're on a clinical trial. And so you have a huge segment of the population not in the trials. And I think there's also the concern that as we are moving towards realizing the promise of personalized medicine, we are doing so for one segment of the population, it seems. And so in more diverse communities, we don't know what the incidence of certain molecular abnormalities are in order for us to estimate what impact really our new therapies are having in terms of improving, morbidity and mortality in those communities. And so I think we often conflate the lack of knowledge about differences that may exist in the incidence or prevalence of these molecular abnormalities, or even in their coincidence. So they may be other molecular abnormalities that inform the severity and the disease course in certain populations. But we don't know, and we assume that the lack of information means there is no difference. And so we just sort of plow on with where we're going with the majority subgroup. And we have a lot of patients who are left behind, who cannot enroll in trials because part of the eligibility criteria are to have a certain molecular abnormality. I think the other issue has to do with eligibility criteria. Now, FDA and Friends of Cancer Research and American Society of Clinical Oncology have collaborated on modernizing or updating eligibility criteria, which have historically just been sort of cut and pasted because you want to sort of get through that IRB approval process. So you just sort of copy and paste from a protocol that's been approved in the past, you slap it on your new trial, and off we go. And a lot of patients are left behind because they have comorbidities that have precluded them from being in those trials. And so examining, those eligibility criteria and really ensuring that they're really applicable to your predictions about the safety of the drug and the mechanism of the action of the drug. Is it important to exclude patients with HIV always when they comprise such a huge segment of our population and are living longer and are developing cancer? If you're developing drugs and those patients are not in trials, we're not going to know how to safely use these drugs with other drugs that they may be taking. And so I think that eligibility criteria are a huge component. That is a significant barrier to a lot of populations. But I also think that the lack of information about, some of the markers that predict response in communities of color is a big problem.
I'm going to take the question a little bit differently. So I think as in relation to raising awareness, not only does it have to be with the patient communities and with the physician communities, I think it also has to be with the sponsors as well who are driving these clinical trials. So we at Medtronic, and I think other companies like us, have had to identify advocates within our organization to really show them, hey, if we're going to serve all populations, we got to show you how the population is going to evolve over time as it relates to ethnicity representation. So then as we start having these more strategic conversations, we really are starting to talk about workforce diversity and what having a diverse and inclusive workforce then brings to our offerings to the patients that we serve. And so making sure that we have advocates even inside of the sponsoring companies is going to be extremely important because they can help us educate partners inside, our clinical partners included, to talk more about how do we start to look at how our therapies may be adaptable to certain demographics and how it might not work in other demographics. A primary example of this is there was a clinical trial that was run in the New York State area that was looking at mitral regurgitation. And mitral regurgitation has a strong correlation to rheumatic fever. So when you look at that connection point, when we first looked at that clinical trial, because I was working in heart valves at the time, our internal partners really did not understand why there was a correlation that was that high of a prevalence in that particular clinical trial, because all of the prevalence data that we had looked at in the US was not in the double digits. It was actually pretty low, especially in the African American population. Well, what we ended up discovering is that when you look at the New York State area, of course, there's going to be a lot of immigrants that might be represented in those clinical trials, people from Caribbean countries, et cetera. And so having cultural competence be part of the conversation inside of the sponsoring companies is going to be critically important. So I'll wait to go too much further than that. But I would say not only raising awareness with the physicians and raising awareness with the patients and overcoming some of those trust barriers, if you will, but also making sure you have advocates and workforce diversity in the sponsoring companies.
hard to be at the end of the panel when. I'll just be brief in, saying that certainly there, like many others, we've found that there are barriers implicit in the life cycle of clinical development. There are institutional barriers that we know that minority patients aren't actually asked to participate in clinical trials as often. So that doesn't even give you the opportunity. And then we know it's not just about asking, it's how you ask. And so to the point of the cultural competency, I mean, that's incredibly important. And we think an incredibly important barrier when we think about how investigators and physicians are engaging with patients. Patient, of course, awareness and understanding. And then finally, of course, eligibility criteria is a key piece of this. I will build on what Lola said as well. We assume because we don't know that there are differences in, molecular signatures and differences in outcome, that there just aren't any. And I think really talking about more of the lack of information that we actually have from the tumor genetics perspective. There was a Nature Medicine article recently that showed 96% of all genome-wide association studies have been done in individuals of European descent. That's global data. 96%. That is, the largest second percent is Asian, the Asian population. So it's really truly not representative of patients, not just in the United States, but at large and in the world, globally. So I think just really continuing to talk about that missing information is very key.
So we live in a global society where people from all over the globe live here in the US. So we all are very rich in diversity and culture. The NYU Center for Asian American Health came up with a study not too long ago that identified that Asian Americans are less likely to be diagnosed with cardiovascular disease. And we all know one of the main criteria to help you identify if you have risk for a heart attack is obesity. So if I go to my doctor and they check my BMI, they're gonna say I'm obese. And I'm going to say, okay, doc, I'm going to go have my McDonald's or my Dunkin' Donuts, thank you, and I'm going to move along. But what they don't take into consideration with Asian Americans is that the BMI may not be as high within that population, but they're at just as much of a risk for cardiovascular disease as anyone else. So what that study from the NYU Center for Asian American Health Studies identified was the misdiagnosing of Asian Americans within cardiovascular disease. So it's important not to look at, when we think about clinical trials and research, it's not just for drug development, but it's also for the guidelines to create evidence-based recommendations on how do we treat our patients and manage them effectively, not just based on a check-the-box criteria, but looking at our individual uniqueness, as the panelists alluded to earlier. So we talked about some barriers, but now let's talk about strategy. What are some strategies, since most of you guys are working in a global environment, that your companies or organizations have undertaken? So we'll start with you, Dr. Richie, since you can start the panels.
We, looking across industry, probably have come to many similar conclusions around building partnerships with patients, communities, investing in relationships with sites and physicians who are dedicated to understanding clinical outcomes for all patients. And certainly education and awareness campaigns, and really doing this in a culturally competent way, in a way that patients can receive information is very important, but not just for patients, for their families, for caregivers, and for that to be available at the time of the treatment decision. Certainly, site placement, logistics. I mean, a lot of patients that are eligible for studies actually can't get to a site that is conducting research. So really giving patients the availability and understanding proactively of what support mechanisms we can offer. So from the industry perspective, certainly we can offer transportation support, meal support, childcare support, and just to consider all of the barriers that a patient is facing, time away from work, time away from family, and how can we really start to help address those? And so really it's just taking that patient-centric view and building that into everything we think about. And certainly from the investigator perspective, thinking about cultural competency training, and actually to maximize those engagement opportunities so that when they are talking to patients about studies, they have a better opportunity to actually bring the patient along and make them aware of all of their treatment options, including, but certainly not limited to, clinical studies. And so I think really just spanning the, again, life cycle of clinical development, we have a lot of opportunity to partner with the community to better understand how we can build that trusted partnership with patients and earn credibility, quite frankly, to earn trust and demonstrate commitment.
So I'm going to talk about it from the vantage point of 3 different stakeholders that we've gotten involved with. So the first one is with the patient. What we found is that when you go straight to the patient with the opportunity for clinical trials, people are like, no, thank you, right? What we found that we had to do was actually go back a step and actually educate them on the disease state first. So make sure they understand the disease state, how it impacts their lives if it's not all the way optimized, understanding what the symptoms are, how they identify those symptoms, because again, for women, we present very differently for heart disease relative to that of men. So just making sure that people actually understand the disease state and then offering them with the opportunity to enroll in clinical trials is first. Second is from the stakeholders of the physician partners. We've instituted now a annual clinical site summit that we actually host on site at Medtronic, where we bring in 30 of our clinical sites from around the US to actually talk and share best practices. One of the conversations that we pulled front and center is how do we drive more diversification in our clinical trials. So we've dedicated half a day to that site, or to that conversation with 30 different clinical sites around the US. Thirdly was really doing an internal campaign within Medtronic to get to the senior most leaders within our company, because once you have advocates at that level, change will then happen. So it's using that grassroots effort to really build the case, communicate it up to drive change. Through our efforts, we've now been able to drive a partnership with the Association of Black Cardiologists, where we are leveraging their competency and their expertise to actually drive clinical trial diversification in one of our major clinical studies that we're doing around heart disease right now. So really excited about the outcomes of this partnership, and we'll continue to communicate back to the patient community, because what we've also found is that once you close the loop in communicating back with the patients on the progress you've been able to make, it then makes enrolling them in future clinical trial sites a lot easier.
So I agree with what the first 2 panelists mentioned. I think in addition to that, I would say that it's really important, as Nicole said, to really provide support mechanisms for patients to be engaged in clinical research or in clinical trials. I think we underappreciate the complexity of being in a clinical trial and the burden to patients and their families in being in a clinical trial, not just from time commitment, but financial costs that are not covered even when you have really good insurance, and which a lot of patients don't. So I think that providing some mechanisms to being able to support the patient in that way. I think the issue in my space, in cancer space, I don't know how many of you have, the last time you read an informed consent form. I think you need like a PhD to understand everything that is in an informed consent form, even when it's the language level is supposedly corrected for a lower level of understanding. And so I think that really having patient navigation programs that help patients through the process of getting care, including getting onto clinical trials, is really important. I mentioned the issue of eligibility criteria. I think that will hopefully help to increase patients' participation in trials. But I think that there's also an important role that really requires some collaborative effort that's quite deliberate to ensure that clinical sites in the United States are equipped with being able to enroll diverse patients in trials, but also that those trials are not just sort of repeated in the same institution. So I trained at Johns Hopkins, which is smack dead in the middle of a very diverse community. But we had underrepresentation of minorities in clinical trials. And it's not because the trials weren't there and the institution wasn't in the community, the patients didn't come, or patients who were there didn't enroll. And so I think that we need to figure out better ways to engage communities in not only designing the research and determining what their needs are at the design stage, not just when you're ready to sort of deploy your trial and now you want to get people to buy in. The buy-in has to be at the conception stage, and I think that's important.
Well, what we have done, like others, is focused on partnerships. So I think we all agree as to what the major barriers are to clinical trial participation. And our approach has been to work with each of the key stakeholders to address these barriers. And if you think about who's involved in the process of clinical trial, they're the sponsors, they're the investigators, they're the referring providers, they're also the clinical sites and the participants themselves. And to just comment briefly on a couple of those, so when you think about the participants, participants or potential participants really need to hear from trusted voices. And if they're going to be receptive to understand, participate, one has to communicate them through trusted voices. And often the sponsor is not that trusted voice, so that we have to identify and work with a key intermediary. The other thing which we've recognized is that it's not only the individual participants, but participants are part of a community. And the community also has to be a part of the increasing awareness, the increasing education, the interest in being involved in clinical trials. So one of the things that we've done there is not only work with our clinical colleagues, you've mentioned, we've heard about the Association of Black Cardiologists a few times, but also with trusted voices in the community. We have an awareness program that we've been working with the National Urban League on developing. And there, it's not only because it's important, it's the right thing to do, it's important for the clinical research, but these are also entrepreneurial opportunities for the clinical trial sites and the participants there, as we all recognize that diversity of the clinical trial sites is also an important part of this. We work with our academic medical centers, which are our colleagues, and working with those centers that are traditional majority, but also minority serving academic medical centers, because we recognize that these centers are often extremely good at the process of doing the clinical trial, but they often fall short in terms of recruiting diverse participants. And some of them, particularly in the oncology area, have very active programs of outreach in terms of clinical trial participation in general. And one just have to add the dimension of diversity or some focus on diversity as a part of that. For our own clinical trials, the things that we're doing internally, we develop educational and awareness programs for our investigators. So at investigator meetings, not only educational programs, we have a video that we produce just to let them know that it's important to us, it's important to do, and for something for them to think about. And working with the clinical trial sites as well in terms of, what are the opportunities to not only overcome barriers, but to incentivize the sites to be more proactive. Because I think as we've heard, and we've heard from the presentation, earlier around oncology and the work that's doing, and also from your comments, the burden of disease, the burden of risk factors, how the diseases manifest is often different, and particularly oncology, where a lot of the therapies are focused toward the disease process and its characteristics, and some of the therapies are directed toward the host and how the host responds to treatment. So it's really important that we know that these treatments are effective. So working with all of those stakeholders, ourselves internally, our key external stakeholders and addressing and overcoming their barriers, I think is the way that we're more likely to develop solutions that can be sustained and also that can be scaled up.
So there seems to be some common themes that from our panel discussion right now and from the ones earlier talking about trust, but also stakeholder engagement, that you need to build relationships within the community. We know clinical research can only be effective when it's conducted within a team approach. And we've highlighted some stakeholders that all of you have engaged with. And in this room, we have stakeholders range from patient advocacy, healthcare providers, industry leaders, and policymakers. And the question is, what are the type of stakeholders you would like to get engaged with that you haven't already engaged with? You mentioned the Urban League, the Black Cardiologists, and some other organizations numerous times, but what are the other stakeholders? For example, I run a nonprofit that deals with a diverse patient population in Northern Virginia. And for me to try to get into the clinical research realm where I want to bring this research opportunities to my patient population, it becomes a challenge because I don't know where to begin. So using my organization example, how would I go about as a stakeholder trying to get engaged with research with any one of you, but also with any of the people in the audience?
I'm happy to start again.
I know it's a tough
Well, I think the people in this room are really a great group of collaborators. I mean, starting with our colleagues at the FDA. I mean, the FDA had developed an action plan, several years ago as to how to increase participation and recruitment. And I think one of the huge advantages there are really all the awareness programs that are being developed. But I think it's you have to work at every level. Probably the largest group that one can engage would be those groups that are considered to be the trusted voices. Yeah. So whether they be in the clinical care arena, and we've heard that a lot of times the research is linked to the clinical care. So who are those trusted voices? And trusted voices often need to be activated. So they're there, but they may not be activated, and then opportunities to really get them involved. And so it's not only, it's civic, it's educational, it's healthcare that are there. Patients and patient groups are really important. The people who are already doing the research, the clinical sites, the academic medical centers, the sponsors, starting there and building on that. You don't need to create, new approaches frequently. You just need to bring them together and work together, because I've often felt that, well, two things, and then I'll stop. One is, this is not a new problem. It's been around for a long, long time. But I think we're at a point now where we can actually make a difference, because you have all these key stakeholders and regulators that are aligned to say that we really ought to do something about this. But if we don't, then nothing may happen again. So we're at that moment in time to do that, and also activating the key people who are involved in clinical research, so that their efforts are sustained and they don't just come and go with ambassadors and evangelists for the issue that are there at that moment in time. So building partnerships and sustaining them, I think, is one of the keys.
Yeah, I echo Dr. Clark's remarks. I think FDA is a little bit unique compared to, we don't conduct our own trials. But we do have opportunity and do collaborate with sponsors of clinical trials to sort of help to provide guidance regarding how trials are designed. We engage with patients. We have patients on our advisory boards to help us decide whether treatments or devices are adequate and should be approved. And we collaborate with academicians in sort of pushing the science. And oncology's very fast-paced therapeutic area, and so to be an effective regulator, you really have to understand the science. And so we engage with researchers. So I think there has to be, as Dr. Clark said, there has to be activation of stakeholders, but also I think that we sort of underestimate what impact we can have by just calling the FDA and saying, what are you doing about this problem? There are some groups who have figured out how to do that, and they're very effective at pushing their agendas. And I think for researchers involved in disparity research, we don't see that as much. And I in my role as a federal employee, I work at FDA. I can't advocate. I don't have that role, but I see a lot of patient groups and professional organizations that mobilize to push certain areas and push certain things, certain agendas. And I don't see that as much, in the disparities community. And I think that we have to hold, our federal agencies accountable for, some of the disparate outcomes we see in our communities. And the only way to do so is to be very vocal and very active and do it very often. And I really encourage, those who are in the audience to really, appreciate the importance and the power in doing so.
Anytime we can work with people who are on the ground, on the boots, community workers that have strong relationships and partnerships with patient advocacy groups, with the centers of trust, be it churches, barbershops, et cetera, we're going to be interested in that. I know that our foundation and many companies like us have major foundations that are looking for partners like the community workers, social workers, et cetera, that have a primary goal of driving down disparities of quick care and inequities of care, are going to be attractive to look for grants and partnerships and things of that sort. And that I would say any type of alignment you could have with the policy groups that are looking to drive policies that, again, target the inequities of care across gender, race, even sexuality, are going to be attractive as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I like what you said about holding our holding our government agencies accountable, holding our sponsors accountable. We need to be accountable for recruiting patients that represent patient populations at large. If we are not accountable, then who is? And I think that change can happen in a lot of different ways, and certainly engaging with those trusted voices and amplifying them and helping us all understand how we can do it better. I mean, there's so many components of this, and I think it's just what we've been doing is putting together basically a giant advisory committee of external stakeholders that are these community voices that represent these patient advocacy groups expressly dedicated to minority health, and trying to really understand and how we can best partner to make change, because clearly this is not a new problem and it's a really complex challenge, and there are multiple components and pieces that have to all move together for us to impact meaningful change. And so it's really partnering across the healthcare continuum that will allow us to ultimately be successful.
So now we'd like to invite our audience to ask questions. So we have 2 microphones. If you'd like to step up to the microphone, please come up. We have time for about 2 to 3 questions.
Good morning. My name is Melissa Robinson. I'm in Kansas City and work for the Black Healthcare Coalition. Can you talk a little bit? The panel was great. Thank you so much for all of the information. I have 2 questions. One for Dr. Clark and Dr. Richie regarding the equity in investment for outreach. So I was first going to talk about parity, but because of the disparities that exist, can you talk a little bit about your balance sheet and about the expenditures regarding outreach to underrepresented communities? And do you feel like that there is equity in spending money to recruit underrepresented individuals into clinical trials? And then for Dr. From the feds, can you talk about the path to rejection of clinical trials without the appropriate representation? So have trials been rejected because they don't have the levels of participation that's necessary for efficacy and safety? Thank you.
Thank you. Did you want to start?
Sure, I'll start. Those are some tough questions. I really cannot answer in terms of the actual dollar amount as related to our research, but I will say that, at Merck, one of the things that we're proud of as a company is that we are now a part of the $1 billion club, which means that there's at least $1 billion per year invested in minority and women businesses. I would say generally, the sponsors are willing to invest in doing this because it's really important. And when I speak to those at our company who do the clinical trials, they'd like to be able to go to sites that can recruit diverse participants on a regular basis. Doing it per trial does not work, and that becomes very, very difficult to do. But there are a number of examples of where we've worked to help to improve this, but there are some limitations as to the kinds of things that can be invested in. So the sponsors would really like to do this. And from the perspective of disparities, many of us feel that increasing diversity in our clinical trials is clearly one of the cornerstone pillars of addressing disparities, particularly as it relates to development of new therapies. And we'd like to do that, but we need help from all these partners that I have described to you.
It's a real area for opportunity. So the way I think about this often is, there are so many pillars that support what we can do, and sponsors can have great intention in engaging with diverse patient populations. But to Dr. Clark's point, then there's a point where there's conflict of interest in how much support we could provide, say, really getting to a community center that has the greatest need for these types of studies to be, available. And that's where I think there's other opportunities around the partnering philanthropy that can support that. And there is interest in that, and that's certainly something we look into, and we are looking into as part of our strategic plan, is how can we build those relationships so we can be supported in a way that's compliant for our business to achieve ultimately the result that we all want. And it's a real area of opportunity that you're highlighting.
So to the issue of rejecting clinical trial because it's not representative, so we review and approve drugs on the basis of a regulatory framework that has its foundations in the law. So Congress tells us what we can and cannot accept in terms of what kind of studies and how we can approve drugs. And so we cannot reject a clinical study that is supporting a marketing application because it doesn't include a certain demographic subgroup in it. So long as at least one population that's relevant to the US population is evaluated in that drug, you can approve it. And I think, generally, I think none of us are here wanting to not approve drugs that may work in some patients. I think we just want to have a more inclusive drug development strategy that enables us to, put out drugs that may be options for different types of patients. And so, no, we do not reject trials that are not representative.
So we have one more question time for one more quick question, so, sir.
My question, Reynold Verrett, I'm president of Xavier University of Louisiana. The question I would ask is about on the clinical delivery and the social service delivery, where we tend to deliver along the lines of the standard racial categories in the United States. When we develop many therapeutics, we assume there's a standard African American or a standard Hispanic. How are you dealing and looking for the admixture problem, especially in these different populations, as we have the capacity for personalized, individualized medicine? How we are looking for, how do we deal with these problems that the assumptions about certain groups that are not given certain drugs because they are African Americans, because they are the standard African Americans where they might be beneficiaries, and vice versa in other groups as well.
Dr. Clark, would you like to?
Sure, I'm happy to give that a try. That's a tough question. I would maybe reframe it a little bit because I think what you're getting to is the heart of an issue that is trying to be addressed, and that is to what extent does the phenotypic representation of these different groups truly represent markers of those things which we consider important, like efficacy and safety around a particular therapy. And it turns out that clearly they're not perfect, but they're actually pretty good. And if you think about any of the major disorders, if you think about in oncology, triple negative breast cancer, cardiovascular, diabetes, other, there are disorders where just knowing the phenotypic presentation of the individual will help you in terms of making decisions about their disease burden, their treatments. But it's clearly not perfect. And there are all the other issues that come into play. And again, particularly as it relates to oncology and some of the markers, the genetic markers, it's a question of how does one utilize that, and how do you appropriately make decisions about patients and participants. So it's a very difficult issue, but as a start, the phenotypic presentation of the different groups by race and ethnicity does have value that I think can get us started, but it's not perfect, and one has to really consider that in all of these decisions, clinical decision making. Also, how do you enroll in clinical trials, and for the participants, which box do they check off, as to which group that they're a part of.
On that briefly, that this will become increasingly relevant as we think about, if you look at the demographics in the United States and the changing populations, the second most fastest growing population is the multiracial population. So as we think about people becoming and the future of what that box ticked is, that will become more ambiguous over time. And so in addition, I think building this strong basis of a genetic and genomic databases across that are inclusive of all demographics will help us really better understand that as we move forward.
So I want to thank the panelists for providing such great insight into this very important topic. So the issue of inclusion of diverse populations in clinical trials continues despite the heroic efforts of our panelists and of all of you guys in the room today. Words are just words if they have no meaning to those who we are trying to reach. For our words to have an impact on those who we are trying to reach, we need to communicate in ways that respect the diversity of our communities. I would recommend that you ask, as you go to different sessions today, you ask your colleagues that are sitting next to you, what are they doing to make a difference within this realm of diversity and improving healthcare? And I want to leave you with a simple quote from Mother Teresa. I alone cannot change the world, but I can cast a stone across the waters to create many ripples. So I encourage you to go enjoy the rest of the day. We have some wonderful panels and CME presentations, and please make some ripples out there. Thank you.